In the legal world, there is a combination of forces that feed a corrupt and suffocating legal system for attorneys. Law schools, law professionals, judges, and even the firms themselves for whom you work create a system, a matrix, if you will, that is nothing like what you thought when you passed the bar exam. The purpose of this podcast is to help you escape this legal matrix, leading you out of the proverbial desert to be free of the bondage of the matrix. Hosted by Bryce D. Nyer, attorney at law with over 30 years experience in the trenches of civil and criminal litigation at the state, federal, and international levels. He's a highly accomplished and resourceful legal professional, a true master of his craft, and he's here to help you get your life back. Here's your host, Bryce D. Nyer.
All right. This is Bryce D. Nyer coming at you live from Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of Fort Bragg, for another episode of Guess What? Escape the Legal Matrix. Well, guess what? We're going to change the format around a little bit about what we discuss here. For the past, year, maybe 2 years, we've been focusing about what law students and lawyers really need to focus on and concentrate on for opening, owning, operating, and leading their law firms, and focusing on the domains of body, being, balance, and business. Well, we want to talk about some things that are real, raw, and relevant. We want to talk about the real law and about cases, things that really affect human beings, have affected human history, and how it applies to your life. Because the reality is things that have happened in the past, decisions have been made by courts, whether in your city, county, state, this country, or internationally, can affect you. So the one thing I want to talk about on today's subject is, when can you disobey, or should you disobey the law? Now, this subject comes up because in today's world, there are so many wars and there are so many conflicts and the rules of engagement, and there's so many accusations of essentially countries committing atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity that is going on across the world. So it brings up this subject. At what point can you or should you disobey, for example, a lawful order or a law? Now, we first saw this in the Nuremberg trials after the completion of World War II in Europe in around May 7th, 8th of 1945. And the Nazi hierarchy, they were arrested, the top dogs, so to speak, and they were brought before the International Tribunal, the Criminal Tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany. Now, those trials, those initial trials, were the top folks like Goering, Rudolf Hess, General Jodl, General Keitel, the top guys in the Third Reich at that time. And basically their excuse was, we were just following orders. And if you've watched movies or you've watched these sayings and things, or you've read things online, you can't, the tribunal at that time, which was comprised of judges from the United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union, the major allied powers of World War II. And at that time, essentially, when they ultimately gave their verdicts, a lot of them were found guilty, and the majority of them were sentenced to death. There were 3 that were acquitted, 1 tried in absentia and sentenced to death. Out of those original Nuremberg war crime trials, the bottom line is, hey, look, following orders is not an excuse to commit atrocities, crimes against humanity, waging war. And in World War II, millions of people were slaughtered, died, murdered, by the Nazi government. And the same thing happened over in the Pacific by the Imperial Japanese. They had war crimes trials over there, though they didn't catch as much fanfare as the Nuremberg trials did. Now, these type of trials were probably the first of their type that had actually been conducted at least in the modern 20th century, that lasted anywhere from 1945 to 1948, depending upon which people were accused and tried of war crimes. For example, a concentration camp, commandants, the guards from in Nazi Germany occupied territories and countries. Then you had the Imperial Japanese who had committed atrocities in China and other countries that they had conquered during World War II. And of course, officially for the Japanese, the war did not end until on or about officially, I think September 2nd, 1945. The atomic bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. And then eventually the Imperial Japanese capitulated. And General MacArthur kind of took over the scene for a while, and they had the war crimes trials. So it begs the question in your life, personally and professionally, at what point can you or should you disobey a lawful instruction, a lawful order? I think probably a lot of law enforcement, a lot of military personnel since World War II have faced this dilemma, have faced this quandary. And there are probably a lot of situations and scenarios that we may never ever know about that were done and that were covered up. There were some that were not covered up. For example, during Vietnam, the My Lai Massacre, where Lieutenant Calley just basically gunned down, women and children and men. Some elderly. In the My Lai Massacre, he was tried, convicted, sentenced to prison, and ultimately his sentence was commuted, I believe, by then President Nixon. And then he went on to move back to Georgia and pick his life back up. But it raised the interesting question again of, who's tried, who's held accountable, and what constitutes a crime against humanity and war crimes, and at what point do should you disobey an order? And you never know if you're going to find yourself in that situation where you're given instructions to do something that is clearly wrong. And you are faced with a really intense, high pressure decision, and what if it's going to cost you your life? There are stories and incidents, even in World War II, where some of the German soldiers in the Wehrmacht and even some in the SS, that refused to commit blatant murder and genocide. And some of those German soldiers paid with their lives. They were executed, or they themselves were sent to concentration camps. And you can Google them and look them up. So, it's going to beg the question as you go through life, at what point in your personal or professional life, in your marriage, with your company, no matter what it is, are you going to live in integrity? We find this a lot even in Christianity, and where in many countries Christianity is outlawed and there is only one recognized religion. And if you go out and you broadcast your Christian beliefs or views, you can actually be jailed, tortured, and executed for those beliefs. And so the question comes up, how far are you willing to go? What are your values and your standards? Are you really committed to living and operating and living in truth, and even if it costs your life? Now, it's easy to talk about these things when you're sitting like I am in the comfort of this office here, the studio where I'm recording this podcast, than it is to actually be out in a situation where your very life is threatened, that if you don't change your value system, if you don't change your beliefs, your life will be ended. And you have to really take a look and admire, those that have been martyred, that have been killed for living by their faith, especially in the Christian circles, or for those in major wars who refused to participate in war crimes and crimes against humanity and atrocities. They just refused to do it. And so it begs the better question for you. How far are you willing to take it? How far are you willing to go to not participate in this spiritual suicide, this atrocities, this crimes against humanity. Because I do firmly believe that when we die, we are held accountable to God, and we will face him in judgment and be held accountable for what we did or failed to do. And in the Christian circles, the issue is whether or not we have repented, whether or not we are forgiven by Jesus, and that basically all of our sins are blotted out. So again, it goes back to many, really, to me, an interesting subject of where we are in the world today. When is killing justified? Are there such things as just wars? Well, and I think there are just wars. I think, for example, again, going back to the example of World War II, had the United States not interceded and fought against Nazi tyranny and against the Imperial Japanese to basically stop the march of this genocide and this insanity and this evil, that millions more would have been slaughtered. They would have died. Generations would have been wiped out. Clearly, Hitler had a plan to eliminate all of the Jews of the world that he could get his hands on. And that was in play. And so at some point, those that are within those evil empires, those that have not joined the forces of evil, that still have that conviction and that conscience inside them, they make this stand that I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to be this co-conspirator of evil. I just won't do it. And it takes immeasurable courage to do that, especially when your own life is threatened to be ended. So could you do it? Could I do it? I mean, I don't think we know until we're faced with that situation what we will or we won't do. I would like to believe that I would have enough courage and I would have enough strength to live in the faith that I believe, to exercise that sacrifice if needed, and that I would not be this coward, that I would not be. And when I was an Army officer overseas for 5 years and 2 months, I never salivated over the thought of going to war. That's just stupid, just ignorant. I never, salivated over killing another human being or taking the life of somebody. And I most certainly did not want to be placed in a situation of where war crimes may be committed in my presence. And, I have to take a stand, report it or not. What do I do? And there were folks that during the Middle East wars, that those sort of things, happen to where some atrocities were allegedly committed or committed by some of the American armed forces, which I'm not going to get into. We can discuss that on another date in another podcast. But I want you to think about that, and I want you to ask the better question: where in your world have you been, or are you faced now with you need to disobey what some people consider a lawful directive, a lawful order, an instruction from the higher ups that will compromise your values, compromise you mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually? And if you're in that position, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's something to think about. It's a deep topic. But again, these were real live cases that happened at the conclusion of World War II. And the International Tribunal said, the excuse of following orders is not enough. It does not justify the crimes against humanity, the atrocities, and the terrible things that these defendants did. It was not an excuse, and they tried it. And that's one of the key lessons that came out of the Nuremberg trials after the conclusion of World War II. So again, ask yourself that better question. Where in your world are you faced with that sort of dilemma? Where are you faced spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally with where you know that you cannot and you will not do something that is so inherently evil or so inherently wrong? And what actions are you going to take? And are you willing to make the ultimate sacrifice? This is Bryce and I coming at you live from Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of Fort Bragg, where every day men and women don the uniform. And one day, they may be placed in a situation to stand firm in their conviction and their values and do the right thing, even at the cost of their own life. This is Bryce out.